Hello, everyone at home. You may be watching when it's live, you may be watching when it's not live, but I thought I'd introduce our lovely guest here, as well as myself. My name is Izzy. I'm the festival director for the Vancouver Comic Arts Festival, which this is a part of. So excited to have Hiromi and Ann here to talk about Shadow Life. I wanted to also begin saying that I'm joining you, the viewer, from my home on the stolen ancestral and traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil Waututh peoples. Especially as comic artists, it's important to think about and recognize the ongoing effects we have on this land and what we can do as well. To start this event, I'd like to introduce two other guests. First, Hiromi Goto is an emigrant from Japan who gratefully lives on the Unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil Waututh Territories. She's written Chorus of Mushrooms, The Kappa Child, along with several of novels for children and youth, a book of poetry, and a collection of short stories. The second person is Ann Zhu, is an Ignatz-nominated cartoonist and illustrator working in Baltimore. She graduated with a BFA in illustration from the Maryland Institute College of Art in 2017. Her graphic novel work includes Shadow Life and Measuring Up. Welcome, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us. So we're going to be doing sort of a behind the scenes talk. Before we begin though, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the Unceded Territories, and it's also known as Victoria, British Columbia. So I'm going to provide a quick summary of the graphic novel, Shadow Life. This is a tale of a 76-year-old Kumiko who's run away from her assisted living housing that her well-meaning adult daughters has set her up in. And it just wasn't a right fit for her. So she took off and finds herself a modest bachelor suite in the gay neighborhood based on Vancouver, British Columbia. And unbeknownst to her, or kind of beknownst to her, Death's shadow has followed her from the seniors housing into East Van, and she's in for the fight of her life. Do you think that about covers it?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess we can get started on our kind of conversation portion of the programming. But Hiromi, for you, this is your first graphic novel. So what made you decide to delve into this format?
My children at the time, this was several years ago, many years ago, my children at the time were very much into manga, and of course they still are now. And they were, introducing me to the ones that they were fond of. And then I was, remembering the ones I used to read way back in the day. And I think I was first introduced to Japanese manga in the 70s. It's a long history of the graphic arts in Japan. And but as a writer, I actually was interested in the form as sort of a writing exercise and a way to explore storytelling in a different kind of way, and sort of, I guess, learn the form by trying to write the form. So to understand the form better, and working within sort of a set of constraints around a narrative that could be depicted and relayed in a visual way. So for writing for novels, you're not so bound by that for all sorts of reasons. So it was a really interesting set of creative constraints. And I was wondering if what kind of reaction you had when you first received the manuscript and read it through the first time.
I really loved it. I was definitely not expecting to get contacted for this kind of project or anything, but I'm glad I did. And when I remember when I first got the manuscript, it felt very I guess in line with the kind of work I also like to make at the time and continue making, I think. I could definitely feel very invested in Kumiko's story and her family and her friends around her, and like all of these like very colorful cast of characters who are, they really come to life even just in the writing, like without that visual component, as you know, the manuscript did not have. But yeah, I was really glad to see such a kind of like unique perspective and way of telling this kind of story.
Thank you. That was so great.
All right, so we are now going to launch into a behind the scenes look at the process for creating Shadow Life. But before we do that, was there anything about the process that surprised you as a longtime author, but first time graphic novel creator?
I think the biggest challenge for me in terms of overall overall pacing and overall like sort of conceptualizing, I kind of see it as a translation of the text form that I wrote into the visual form that you take it into. But there's also like this kind of translation that happens between those formats. And then what I didn't know clearly to my mind was how many like actual images per writing bits would turn out to be, because it wasn't, because I didn't do, you know, I know some writers of graphic novels actually tell direct what's in each panel, and I didn't do that. So my script looked very much kind of like a screenplay script with, and I didn't define which things would be illustrated. And so I had no idea how long each thing would take in terms of drawing pages. So that was like a big sort of conceptual learning that I did watching us go through this process. And that was like really, really fascinating to watch. And so, yeah, I really really appreciate that part of that learning that happened.
Yeah, I think it's definitely hard to like visualize how many pages something will take, especially if you're not really used to like thumbnailing or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I had this kind of vague idea that each chapter should be about 8 to 10 pages max. But even doing that, I mean, there's like so many micro ways that things could be illustrated. It doesn't actually necessarily matter. The page, it might not be the page count that matters. So it was all very fascinating. So, and you know, have a history publishing comics and also measuring up middle grade graphic novel, which I highly recommend for all the viewers out there to pick up. How is Shadow Life the same and or different from these other projects that you've worked on?
So for that, I think first and foremost, like, because prior to working in graphic novels, I did mostly like short comics, like mini comics. The length of the project is definitely the first learning curve, which I think is true for me and also for pretty much any other comics creator or cartoonist who kind of makes that transition from short form work to long form work, because it's not even like just the amount of like actual pages that has increased, but it's also like these really little things that you don't consider when you're making like an 8-page comic or something, like scanning it and then cleaning it and then like lettering it, and all these like much smaller tasks suddenly like multiply
Right.
at like all of these steps, right? So that was, I think, definitely a learning curve that I had to sort of develop, I guess, and like kind of grow into, which is like kind of an ongoing process, I think, for like fine tuning the way I do long books still. But yeah, and then compared to measuring up, It was definitely interesting, I think, for me to work on these two books, which are very different in, both audience, because Measuring Up is middle grade and Shadow Life is for adults, and then also the content. But I like it. I think it's interesting to kind of dabble in like these two very different things. It's also kind of like the way I draw for adults is a little bit different than the way I draw for younger kids. Like I let myself be looser in Shadow Life, or, like slightly more realistic in ways compared to like Measuring Up, where I try to emphasize, things looking a little bit simpler, more kind of like clean in places, because since it's in color, it also has to, have the flatting and the color added in, so it's easier to work with those clean lines. But yeah.
Would you say working like in terms of the technical crafting of it, is it take longer or shorter times to do either or in the different kinds of illustrating, or?
Like for kids or for adults, do you
Yeah,
mean? Or
yeah.
I kind of think they probably both end up shaking out to like the same time amount, I guess, because, well, I guess it depends on, I suppose it depends on the page and things like that as well. But like, for Measuring Up, it had to be flattened and colored, which I did have a lot of help for coloring from my friend Sunmi, who colored the book. But that's like another factor that has to be taken into it. Whereas for Shadow Life, like there are gray tones which I've put in, but they don't need to be so tightly done because the lines themselves are more illustrative and a little bit looser. So I can't really like exactly follow that line all the time. Yeah, I think the actual inking itself probably doesn't change too much in terms of the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So, with that conversation portion done, how about we give everyone a look behind the scenes at the process of Shadow Life?
Great. So in this section, I'll be reading from the manuscript version of the script. So this is the actual script that. So I'll be reading from the actual script that Anne received, and then I'll be reading them sort of one page at a time. So, and then at the end of the page, Anne will speak to the choices she made as an artist, and all the different kinds of significant decisions she made for that page itself. So we're jumping into chapter 4. Kumiko has just bought a secondhand vacuum cleaner at a neighborhood shop, and she's walking home with her new acquisition. Chapter 4, sound effects. Gara, 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 gara. Aerial view of cute vacuum cleaner being dragged by the hose down the sidewalk. Pedestrians glance at Kumiko and the cleaner. Aside from her tilted neck, she walks proudly as if she's showing a prize dog at Crufts. Sound effects. Gara, 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 gara. Vantage point. From Kumiko, slightly to the right of her feet, about a meter in front, she sees some children's feet. They're kicking a giant pine cone. It's an early one, scales still sealed, solidly shut. Kumiko's eyes widen with surprise. It's the largest pine cone she's ever seen, almost as big as a pineapple, closer to round than conical. Oh, okay. So I guess I'll keep on reading to the end of page 71 then. The children's feet treat it like a soccer ball, kicking it back and forth
I'm
to each
sorry, I
other.
just realized I was muted because
Oh,
there were
oh,
sirens
oh,
earlier. I
oh,
was
so,
talking and then I was like, oh no.
Okay.
You can keep reading to the end of
No.
71
I
though.
think it's better if you go at the end of the
Okay,
page. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah.
got it. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, so for this, just kind of following the panel descriptions of what is in the script, have like kind of a fondness personally for like using these taller vertical panels where I can. I feel like it's very conducive to like the vertical page of a book. But yeah, thought the sound effects were very fun in this, especially I liked kind of adding all of those in. Yeah, I'll let you continue now, Hiromi.
Okay, so the top of page 71. The children's feet treat it like a soccer ball, kicking back and forth to each other, laughing and enjoying themselves. One of the scales open, and from inside the dark of the gap, something glints that might be an eye, looking at Kumiko, before the scale clicks shut as a child kicks it again. Kumiko squints and blinks, shaking her head. Kumiko thinks, what? Shakes
Right.
her head again.
Yeah, so for this, I wanted to incorporate like this kind of moment to moment action where you see like almost the pine cone, like sort of, I wanted to like incorporate a feeling of like watching it fall like very slowly, like very gently in that arc before like the next very quick action of the child hitting it with their foot. But yeah, like, you know, that kind of panel layout will be called moment to moment, where just one thing changes in like a small instance. And then continuing down the page, also in page 70, but I like using these like stark black fill backgrounds as well for these kind of like either shocking or like she is thinking panels. Yeah.
And starts walking again, but more slowly. Gara, gara, gara. Falters to a stop, looks back. The three children are sending the pine cone farther and farther. A child shifts her position, pulling her leg back to kick the cone out toward the busy street. Kumiko, stop! The child, shocked by Kumiko's ferocity, is frozen with leg still pulled back. Kumiko smiles to reassure the child. When Kumiko smiles this way, kind, warm, and reassuring, her eyes turn into inverted half circles, her face creased with many wrinkles. Kumiko, sorry to interrupt your play.
I really loved the description of the way Kumiko smiles. That kind of like description of the way her wrinkles go when she smiles and like the way her eyes turn into like half crescent moons really resonated with me. So I kind of wanted to make sure to keep that in mind as I did. Oh my gosh. It's very loud here, so you'll have to excuse that. Yeah, I wanted to incorporate that and keep that in mind, not only for this panel, but throughout the book. And then in the middle of the page, you'll see that the stop is, you know, hand lettered instead of using the font that I made. And so for these like really like loud interjections, I wanted to use that to convey more of that impact.
So, top of 73. But do you think I can have that? Points at pine cone. Child, sure, doubtfully. The two other children nudge each other and eye Kumiko and her vacuum cleaner with suspicion. One of the children hisses at the would-be kicker. Child number 2, don't talk to the stranger. Child number 3, stranger danger, stranger danger. Kumiko flaps her hand back and forth, her brow furrowing with alarm, awkwardness. Kumiko, I'm not that kind of stranger. I just want the pine cone. I'm just like your grandma. The close-up of her daughter's face, Mitsu, pops into her mind. Her crabbiest, oldest daughter, she is scowling, practically quivering with indignation. Mitsu, You get yourself into these situations and then you start laughing, making it even worse. Kumiko's mouth drops open and she begins to laugh. Kumiko slaps her thigh. Bwahahahaha. Tears trickling down her wrinkled cheeks. Her neck is still sore, so she has an odd, rigid posture. Kumiko. Oh, uh-oh. She squeezes her upper thighs together, thinks, don't you dare.
All right, so for this one, I really liked incorporating the kids into this scene. Kids have like such a way of being very direct and not caring about what people might think, and so like them kind of like openly dragging Kumiko in front of her was very funny to me. And then kind of continuing down the page, I used this like kind of more cloud-like, more thought bubble outline for the entire panel of Kumiko's imagination of Mitsu, because you know that will work well enough as its own panel border, so I didn't want to bother with like the rectangle. I think you're muted, Hiromi.
The children. She's a witch. She's a witch. Child number one kicks hard the giant pine cone. It hurtles into the middle of the street. The children scatter, shrieking. Kumiko, oh dear, looks around stiffly, hoping that no one thinks she's a pedo. The pine cone has shot onto the road and then rolled the last few feet directly into the path of an approaching bus. Because of the angle and momentum, instead of being crushed, it is propelled outward, shooting past Kumiko, whizzing past her face.
Right, so I found this panel of like she's a witch very fun to draw. And then like the children's shrieking is incorporated via like this hand lettering that gradually gets smaller and smaller as it continues down. And then with like this motion of the pine cone being kind of tossed around in the street by the motion, I wanted to focus especially on making sure that you could read where it's going, especially since it's, you know, changing direction once. And then I also have to make sure that I show Kumiko's expression as it passes her. So the action lines will help with that.
Pine cone continued, and into the dense branches, leaves of a laurel hedge. The pine cone bounces off the hedge and clatters towards Kumiko's feet, comes to a stop. Kumiko stares. The hard armor of the cone has sustained damage. Kumiko, you're the biggest pine cone I've ever seen in my life. She picks it up, peers at it, turning it around to see if there's an open place like she'd seen before. But there's nothing like an opening. She shakes it, listens for a sound. Kumiko, probably just my imagination. She holds it in one palm. It fills her hand. You're cuddlier than a cactus and less work than a cat.
All right, so continuing the line of motion from the previous page, since the pine cone is moving right, I wanted to make sure that I maintained that throughout the next page so that the viewer doesn't get confused as much as I can, you know, encourage that. Yeah, and I did really like the description of her kind of like letting the pine cone fill her entire hand. I really like the visual of that. So yeah, this page was a lot of fun. I think you are muted again, yes.
Maybe I'll just leave it on. It won't fit in her pocket, too big. There's an indent on the top of the vacuum cleaner where one slips in one's hand to prise off the lid to access the bag. Kumiko sets the pine cone into the depression, the pine cone on its side continues pulling the vacuum cleaner home. Cutaway. Kumiko has made it to the front of her apartment building. It's gone cold, dark, wet again. Fat droplets of rain begin to fall. Kumiko looks anxiously up at the rain.
All right, so on this page, I added like little sound effects or like a here and there to kind of convey more what's going on as well as the visual. And then after the first 3 panels, using more distance in the gutter between the panel borders to show that there's more time that has passed. And I really liked starting to draw this rain scene and like kind of creating the atmosphere of the rain falling down toward her.
Kumiko then looks down at the vacuum cleaner. The pine cone is no longer there. She looks further down the walk, is fallen out in a darker spot. Kumiko goes back to pick it up. When she carries it toward the door, it seems to shudder or twitch, and it rolls out of her hand. Kumiko frowns, shakes her head.
All right, so on this page as well, definitely I tried to make use of those like little visual effects, the little the little squiggly lines around the pine cone to show that something is like happening, like it's shuddering a little bit maybe, or like there's some kind of like buzzing there. And then it sort of rolls off on its own with like that other little squiggle. Yeah, I really liked kind of putting this like soft gray gradient over these panels to convey the feeling of like the darkness from the rain. Yeah.
She crouches down to pick it up again. She clamps it under her armpit and gets her keys for the door, awkwardly tries to open the door and grabs the vacuum cleaner. As she steps over the threshold, sound effect, crack.
All right, so for this, obviously I tried to keep the focus in this like last very like dramatic crack panel. And like, it's hard to sort of tell what's happening exactly here, right? Because it's not mentioned until later what exactly is cracking. But as far as like the visuals go, like having these like very gestural lines in the background to create the depth of the background, but also like the feeling of like the motion or like the sound of the crack that's going on. Yeah.
Kumiko pauses, eyes widen. Kumiko, Jesus, that wasn't my neck, was it? The pinecone is practically shuddering in her armpit, and shadows are yawning behind them, although light sources aren't moving. It's as if she is caught in some kind of shadow vortex, but she doesn't know because it's behind her, i.e., cast upon the front stoop and onto the sidewalk. Close up of doorway, the mirror, ward against evil, has cracked. Kumiko has not noticed. She is staring at the pinecone that seems to be twisting inside her armpit. It's gone still. Kumiko, what on earth? She looks behind her. The writhing shadows are still. Kumiko shivers. Kumiko, the sun's so low during the winter. I'm chilled to the bones.
Yeah, so in this, I wanted to make sure that the twisting shadows behind her and the way they stopped once she looked behind herself was very clear. So using the same viewpoint of her and like making sure that like you could see that these like shadows are twisting, even though obviously she is just standing still there. And then also in places here using that like spot black fill to increase the contrast of some panels or make it more dramatic or like clear what we're looking at, since, you know, like for example in panel 3 this is not like a black wall or anything, but walls and things like that could be filled in with black to just increase the dramatic effect of it.
She shakes her head once more, then steps over the threshold. All of the long shadows stretch toward the pine cone, the bottom end that sticks out beyond her back. The shadows whisk into the pine cone. The front door of the apartment slams shut. Half of the mirror ward falls onto the ground, shatters.
All right, so for this, I tried to make use of the panel borders and breaking them a little bit with the shadow to emphasize the way it's creeping in towards the pine cone. And then like emphasizing the visual of the way like a heavy apartment door would, you know, like at the last moment before it closes, it kind of like slows down before it clicks the lock. And then like the last of the shadow is like sneaking right into that small crack. And then you see the crash sound effect after that. And then the mirror is broken on the floor.
I love listening to you describe all the choices that you've made. It just, I want you to do that for me. The entire manuscript. Every time you do that, I learn so much, and it's just really actually so thrilling. I love it. Thank you. That's great.
No worries. Yeah, it's like definitely there are a lot of kind of decisions that I make unconsciously that I don't always think about until I have to explain them, but there's usually some kind of reason why for everything, right? So
Yeah.
it's elucidating for
Yeah.
me too, I think.
Yeah, there's like so there's all these, you're constantly making all these decisions to highlight certain things or eliminate unnecessary things. Like when I read it out loud, I realized that she nods a lot. And I was just like, why is she nodding so much? And it's like, it's not a film. It's not a film. Anyways, so then, like, I just love this whole process when we talk about it out loud.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
All right, then I guess with that, we'll be wrapping up our programming for this. But yeah, it was great to talk with you more, Hiromi, and to be able to show the audience at VanCAF a little bit of the process behind the book.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I really like seeing the inside. I'm sure everyone will else as well. If you're interested in picking up a copy, consider a local bookseller, like one of our partners, Lucky's or Pulp Fiction. Yeah, thank you so much, Hiromi and Ann, for being here. Really.